For a long time, the U.S. nuclear thinking was preoccupied by the Russian threat, and China is a much smaller secondary consideration. But now I think the new thinking is China has become a near competitor, if not an equal competitor in the nuclear domain. And U.S. has to plan about the scenario where Russia and China would coordinate and present a joint nuclear threat to the United States.
So, given that Putin is, I guess, threatening nuclear war, now seems to be a good time to have an expert on the Chinese nuclear program. To discuss, we have Tong Zhao, scholar at the Carnegie Center based in Beijing, who focuses on China's nuclear program. Co-hosting with me today is Raven Witherspoon, a current Schwarzman scholar. Welcome to China Talk, you two.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, the war. What struck? What's been most striking to you watching China processing and responding to Putin's invasion of Ukraine over the past few weeks?
So the most striking thing is it is apparent that China has a fundamental different perception and understanding about the nature of the war from the perception of the Western countries. China genuinely believes that this is a war that was provoked by the United States and the Western countries. And Russia was forced into taking action to legitimate security interests. And after the war started, China sees what it believes is Western countries uniting together and taking all sorts of illegal measures to strangulate Russia. It was a joint attack with the aim to not only destabilize Russia, but also to provoke internal instability with the eventual goal of maybe overthrowing the Russian government, the Russian system. So that's, given this perception about the nature of the war, it is no surprising that China takes its current position of refusing to condemn Russia and has shown interest in providing Russia with some economic support. It is even possible that China has been considering military support to Russia as part of their bilateral military cooperation. And the information gap between China and the rest of the world is also very salient. The Chinese people, including Chinese experts, they absorb different information from the Western countries. One interesting example is the Russian accusation of the U.S. conducting illegal biological weapon research in a number of bio labs in Ukraine. And the majority of Chinese people, including the majority of Chinese security policy experts, seem to genuinely believe in those accusations. So when you have completely opposite understandings about basic facts, there is no way that China is going to see eye to eye with Western countries about this war and about what they should do together to end this war.
Yeah. So let's stay on that for a second. You mentioned your sense is that the Chinese government has a sincere belief that it was actually all NATO's fault, I guess. What are the kind of data points to support that that argument? How do you sort of divine between sincere and unsincere interpretations of what's going on in policymakers' heads?
The concern about NATO is longstanding and very deep. Even when I was a student in middle school, when the NATO mistakenly bombed Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo War, the overwhelming national narrative was very anti-NATO. Everyone was told, NATO was a military alliance that that is behaving in a very aggressive way to achieve its hegemonic objective. They blatantly violated all basic international laws and rules. So that narrative is very deep, very deeply embedded in all Chinese minds. So growing up in this environment, there is no doubt that the majority of Chinese people, they have this deep concern about NATO for a very long time. So they have been interpreting current contemporary international affairs through that lens. So there is no doubt the blame on NATO is genuine.
Sure. So I guess the other question is like, there is a potential counter narrative that you can buy into what's going on here, which sort of takes traditional Chinese foreign policy principles and applying things like self-determination and non-interference in other countries' affairs, and looking at that and sort of using those lenses, you would come to a very different conclusion about what's going on. So, in your sense, or why did those narratives not sort of hold sway in this case?
I think it is because China believes that the Western countries, they never really respected international laws and principles. When we are facing a situation where it's apparent that the Western countries are being aggressive, they try to destroy Russia. And after that, they will focus their fire against China, right? So China will be their next target. So when you face this existential threat perception, I think politicians will conclude it would be naive if you simply uphold so-called principles, international laws, when your enemies never respect those. So I think the feeling here is the stakes are too high to be naive, and we have to prioritize preserving our own strategic interests, which is to help Russia from being destroyed by the West and maintain the very important China-Russia strategic partnership.
So it's interesting because, you made an argument on Twitter that your sense is, in fact, that the Chinese government didn't know the war was going to happen before it started. And, this seems like something you would want to tell a strategic partner you were going to do before you did it. So first off, why do you think Beijing wasn't aware? And how do you think that, as you argued, them not being told will impact the way Beijing will see Moscow going forward?
I think, according to revelations from U.S. intelligence community, China's own intelligence community did not seem to have provided Chinese leaders with an accurate prediction about Russian intention. They seem to, the Chinese intel community seems to have failed to predict the war. I think before the war, the mainstream Chinese thinking was the mainstream thinking within the Chinese policy community was that Putin was deploying massive troops on the border of Ukraine in order to make a military posture. And he was trying to use this posture to create enough coercive leverage to achieve his political goal. So it was, possible that under such coercive pressure, Ukraine and Western countries would make necessary concessions, so there will be no need to conduct a military operation. But even if the Ukrainians, the Westerners, they didn't concede, maybe Russia would launch some limited and low intensity military operation. And even in that case, it would be a quick type of military operation. I I don't think China foresaw a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and certainly didn't foresee this war dragging on for so long. Even from Putin's perspective, even though he has shown, even though he probably had a strong inclination to launch a full-scale war in early February when he met Chinese counterpart Mr. Xi in Beijing, I don't think he had 100% made that final decision, right? He, as I said, he was probably waiting and see whether his coercive pressure would achieve the political goal without having to push the button. But after he left Beijing, after it became more and more apparent that there was no concession from the other part, then he eventually made the decision. He apparently kept his decision to a very small number of high-level officials in his inner circle. Most of his civilian and military officials, let alone his soldiers, didn't appear to know his decision. So when he was not 100% ready or fully determined to go to war, it was not surprising that I think he didn't fully reveal his war plan to Mr. Xi in Beijing on February the 4th.
So speaking of pressing the button, most of your scholarship focuses on nuclear policy. So I guess I'm curious before we jump into this. This is a kind of like a very dark, serious topic to devote your scholarship to. What personally got you interested and passionate about studying and writing on this?
Well, it was exactly because the stakes involved in these issues. I was a student in physics when I was studying at Tsinghua University. I happened to take the class taught by Professor Li Bin, who is also a nuclear physicist, but he started arms control issues and became a leading arms control expert in China. And he taught this class on science, technology, and international security. And I became really interested in arms control issues, nuclear weapons policy after taking this class, and have since been working with him on many of these issues. So I think it is, it's always puzzling to me, why human beings, we have to use nuclear weapons to threaten each other. Otherwise, we couldn't even live peacefully together. Why do we have to do this when the risks are so high? And the more I studied it, the more I realized, how dangerous the nuclear posture really is, how close we once were to a nuclear catastrophe during the Cold War. And even today, I think the risk of nuclear conflict is still higher than most people really realize.
So let's do since you mentioned history, let's do a brief history of China's Cold War nuclear development and nuclear policy. How did it evolve, starting with Mao and then through the subsequent premiers?
Well, so basically, China felt it was threatened with nuclear weapons by the United States during the Korean War and the Taiwan Strait crisis in the 1950s. And I think Chinese leaders also felt in order for China to become a respected country, power, it needed nuclear weapons. Otherwise, the Western countries wouldn't listen to China with respect. So China started its program in the late 1950s, received a lot of support from the Soviet Union. But after China-Soviet relationship deteriorated, China basically worked on its nuclear program independently. So it successfully detonated its first nuclear bomb in 1964. It continued investing in the program, even though the Chinese economy was running into huge difficulties. So the program received less funding during periods of economic hardship. But China managed to gradually and incrementally improve its nuclear capability and acquired a basic strategic deterrent capability by the 1980s. And in the decades following that, China, as its economy started to take off, China has constantly invested in the program. So we have seen a modest but constant effort to modernize its nuclear arsenal. But all this seems to have changed since the since early 2010s.
Let me stop you. We'll get there. 我和我的祖国. I don't know if you saw that one or sort of other recent movies. It seems like there's like a recent resurgence in idealizing the nuclear program of the 1960s. Has this struck you as well? What do you think is driving the kind of particular glorifying of that moment in history in recent years?
Yes, it's China's successful nuclear program, or it's sometimes called 两弹一星, which actually refers to the nuclear bomb, the rocket and the satellite programs. So China, has been very proud of its achievements in successfully developing these strategic capabilities. And it has been used as an example of the success of Chinese model, the capacity of the Chinese government to concentrate resources on some strategic projects and make impressive achievements. This is an example that can inspire patriotic sentiments in the general public. The defense industry, the nuclear establishment that helped produce nuclear weapons, missiles, were widely portrayed as the most patriotic organs of the Chinese society. It's very different from how Western countries look at defense industry. They were portrayed as a selfish defense military industrial complex that pursue their own interests that sometimes conflicting with the national interests of the general public. But here, the defense industry, they are portrayed as very selfless. They all they want to do is to promote China's national interests. They make huge sacrifices in this progress. So this is all part of this national narrative that if we work together, if we all try to sacrifice ourselves in promotion of our collective interests, we will become a strong and respected power in the international community.
It's interesting, Tong. I was in New Mexico for much of December of this past year, and I made a point to go to Los Alamos and go to all the sort of nuclear history museums, and it was really interesting how America framed it, because on the one hand there is this incredible engineering accomplishment, right, of being the first country in the world to figure out how to do this sort of thing, but tinged with all of it, and tinged in particular in sort of the best books that cover this, the Oppenheimer documentary, the making of the Oppenheimer biographies of late, the making of the atomic bomb, which is oh my god, the best book ever. Everyone should go and read. Is this real sort of sorrow and regret and guilt, which comes with being the only country in the world to have used nuclear weapons to kill people, and it's interesting and makes a bit of sense, I guess, that a nation that hasn't used this weapon in war can have a somewhat different emotional relationship to the creation story of the weapon than the U.S., which there's a lot of there's blood on the hands of the folks who created America's bomb.
Yes, in comparison, there is no similar self-reflection on the part of Chinese nuclear scientists and engineers. You rarely see people reflecting on their role in creating these capabilities. So it's very, very different.
Kind of coming back to China, nuclear weapons, and China's defensive strategic posture. How did nuclear weapons evolve doctrinally, coming up into from the 60s up until, say, 2010?
In officially there is no change in nuclear doctrine. China's longstanding position is China's nuclear weapons only aim at achieving one goal, which is to prevent other countries from using nuclear weapons on China. And if that deterrence fails, then China would conduct nuclear retaliation. It doesn't seek to use nuclear weapons to deter any non-nuclear military threats. So in order to fulfill this goal, the doctrine is China should acquire a second strike capability, a credible second strike capability, which means even if the enemy conducts overwhelming, comprehensive first strike on China, China can still have enough nuclear weapons surviving this disarming strike, which China can use to conduct retaliation and inflict enough damage on the enemy. And this capability to conduct nuclear retaliation would deter the enemy from using or threatening to use nuclear weapons on China in the first place. So that has been the long-standing position. But there is debate among Chinese experts community about how assured a second strike capability China should pursue. Some experts believe, as long as the enemy wouldn't be able to tell if it has the 100% capability to fully destroy Chinese nuclear arsenal, as long as there is a chance that some Chinese nuclear weapons could survive and could be used in the retaliation, that uncertainty would be good enough to deter an enemy nuclear threat. But some Chinese experts think that China needs to demonstrate 100% assured retaliation capability. There should be no doubt in the enemy mind that China can retaliate and can cause unacceptable damage. So I think this debate is evolving and maybe shifting towards pursuing more assured second strike capability, and that may explain some of China's recent nuclear modernization efforts.
So China's recent modernization efforts, which you've just mentioned, have generated a lot of buzz in international security circles. Could you briefly summarize some of the more pertinent developments in Chinese nuclear capabilities in the last couple of years, and then also touch on how doctrine and rhetoric have shifted alongside these changes, although not officially, what some of their conjecture seems to be about how things might be changing?
China has officially embarked on an effort to develop a nuclear triad capability, which means China is pursuing land-based nuclear capabilities, sea-based nuclear capabilities, and airborne nuclear capabilities, which is a departure from China's traditional emphasis on land-based nuclear forces. China didn't really have an air-based capability for decades, and only started to develop sea-based nuclear capabilities in recent decades. And it was revealed last year that China appears to be building at least 3 major silo bases in northwestern China. And each of these silo bases may be armed, may consist of more than 100 missile silos. And these silos appear to be for the deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. So this development alone could add hundreds of additional nuclear warheads to China's arsenal. For decades, it was believed that China has maintained a very small arsenal of about 200 nuclear warheads. So you can tell, this is a major increase of the Chinese arsenal size. And this is only part of what China appears to be doing to modernize its nuclear forces. In addition to the silo bases, China is also adding more road mobile ICBM missiles. And China is massively developing its sea-based nuclear forces. It currently has 6 nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Each can carry up to 12 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And according to U.S. DoD assessment, China will add more nuclear strategic submarines to its current fleet in the coming years. And China is, as I said, developing airborne nuclear capability as well, according to U.S. assessment, and is conducting development on a new long-range strategic stealthy bomber that can be nuclear capable. So taking all this into consideration, the U.S. DoD predicts China will develop up to 700 nuclear weapons by 2027 and more than 1,000 by the end of this decade, 2030. So again, this is a very significant and very quick increase of Chinese nuclear arsenal. And looking at the postures, in addition to the capabilities, there are also signs that China is thinking about developing launch under attack or launch on warning capabilities, meaning that China is acquiring a strategic early warning system, and China can use this early warning system to detect an enemy launch of missiles as soon as it happens, and then be able to launch a retaliation even before the enemy warheads would detonate over Chinese territory. This is a posture that U.S. and Russia, this is a capability that U.S. and Russia have already possessed, and China appears inspired to acquire some similar capabilities. This will be a major change in Chinese nuclear posture because for decades, international observers believe China has maintained a very modest and recessed nuclear posture. China probably separate its warheads from the missiles during peacetime and even store them at separate locations. This would reduce the risk of unauthorized nuclear launch. But if China is now shifting towards launch on warning or launch under attack postures, that will, I think, make the situation more volatile, might increase the risk of, false alarming leading to unnecessary use of nuclear weapons. It is also reported that China is conducting research on orbital hypersonic weapon system that can be nuclear capable. This is a type of capability that only China is reportedly developing. There is no confirmation from China and no explanation about why China may be interested in such capabilities. So I think the US and Western countries are worried not only because China is increasing the numbers and changing some of the postures, but also because it is unclear what military motivation is driving such Chinese development.
In the nearly 5 years I've been doing this show, recording remotely has always been a bit of a nightmare. Halfway through a great conversation, a connection would die, servers would time out, the audio quality would go busted. The better a conversation went, the more stressed out I got that I would end up losing the audio. I tried at least 5 different software solutions, including Zencastr, Zoom, Ringer, and Squadcast, but all of them lacked the functionality and reliability of what I finally landed on, Riverside. Riverside has a great feature suite from local and cloud-based recording so that even if my guest internet is garbage, I still have decent sound to share with you all, to 4K video, which I'm going to start using to spruce up the China Talk YouTube channel. But most important, it just works. Before Riverside, 10% of my recordings broke, but in the past 2 years I've been rolling with Riverside, it has been absolutely rock solid. If you're a podcaster or YouTuber, or just someone who runs online events, check the platform out at riverside.fm.
And this concern on the part of Western countries, it seems that some people are also a bit concerned about potential arms race dynamics. You've mentioned in some of your writings previously that China is not particularly interested in arms control at the moment, and with the Pentagon projections that you just mentioned, that China could potentially triple its arsenal in the coming years. Do you have any thoughts on what the world might look like if China were to seek that kind of numerical parity with the US and Russia, and how policy might shift accordingly?
I don't think China is currently aiming to seek nuclear parity with US and Russia. We need to remember that the US and Russian nuclear arsenals are still at least one order of magnitude greater than Chinese nuclear arsenal. It would take China a lot of effort, a lot of resources and money to reach that level. And it's more likely that the Chinese leadership now wants to massively increase the arsenal in an open-ended process, and will make another evaluation later to understand whether China needs to further expand its arsenal or not. So I think it could be an open-ended process with no final decisions reached to reach nuclear parity. That said, given the speed of the Chinese nuclear buildup and the lack of transparency about its end of its end goal, this could motivate the U.S. planners to think in a worst-case scenario manner. And there is already discussion in Washington that it's time for U.S. to consider the threats of Chinese and Russian nuclear programs simultaneously. For a long time, the U.S. nuclear thinking was preoccupied by the Russian threat, and China is a much smaller secondary consideration. But now I think the new thinking is China has become a near competitor, if not an equal competitor in the nuclear domain. And U.S. has to plan about the scenario where Russia and China would coordinate and present a joint nuclear threat to the United States. And in that case, the U.S. may need to, significantly readjust its nuclear capabilities and the nuclear postures.
That's horrifying.
Yes, that's very, very destabilizing. That will, I think, lead to, a very destabilizing situation if the U.S. believes it has to have the capability to deal with both Chinese and Russian capabilities simultaneously. And China and Russia believe that they also need to independently counter American nuclear threat. It's very hard to create a stable situation among the three parties. Because I don't think Russia and China have deep enough trust to fully incorporate their nuclear capabilities and fully coordinate their nuclear strategy, doctrine, and posture. So Russia and China probably still see their objective as being able to independently deter the U.S., whereas the U.S. may feel the necessity to deter both Russia and China simultaneously. So how to create a stable situation when their thinking, are apparently different is the challenge.
How to create a stable situation when Putin is invading countries is also a tricky question. I'm curious, Tong, if there was any sort of reaction among China nuclear experts about the Putin raising his nuclear warning and that now being a specter which is hanging over the current conflict. Is that at all impacting or you think may impact future calculations about how China should think about its nuclear posture going forward? The fact that we're much closer than we've been in 30 years to anything like this happening.
Yeah, but I think in general, China appears mostly sympathetic to Putin's recent measures to raise the alert levels of its nuclear forces and to conduct two nuclear exercises after the invasion started. I think China basically thinks that Putin was raising the nuclear alert level as a deterrent to dissuade NATO and Western countries from providing military support to Ukraine and from further intervening in the war, including from imposing more economic sanctions on Russia. So China interprets Russia's nuclear signaling in a defensive perspective, believing that this was all a defensive Russian effort to deter external intervention. So it was not that particularly alarmed by Putin's nuclear saber rattling. Whereas in the West, I think there is this concern that Putin is becoming deranged, right? If he's cornered, if he faces major conventional military defeat in Ukraine, he could deliberate escalate the war to higher levels, potentially across the nuclear threshold. So in the West, the threat perception about Russian nuclear escalation is more serious, whereas in China, I don't think China fully appreciates the risk of nuclear escalation. As I said, they think Putin is acting rationally and simply in a self-defensive manner. So they don't think there is a serious risk of nuclear escalation. Maybe that's contributing to China's less sense of urgency in doing everything to end the war as soon as possible before it further escalates. And by the way, the reason China itself has been building up its nuclear forces in recent years is also because China wanted to be able to deter U.S. and Western military intervention in a future conventional conflict over the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. So Chinese nuclear thinking, I think, is similar to the Russian nuclear thinking, which is a bigger nuclear arsenal, a greater nuclear capability would help limit the military options of the U.S. and Western countries in the conventional conflict. So I think that similarity in nuclear thinking also makes China more sympathetic to Russia's current nuclear posture and be less worried about the escalation risk over Ukraine.
The distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, tactical, are the sort of idea of a tactical nuclear weapon is a smaller payload directed more at kind of like winning a position on a battlefield, in a particular fight, as opposed to strategic nuclear weapons, which are, aimed to blow up entire cities. There is a concern that Putin would consider using these sort of smaller nuclear weapons as a signaling mechanism, which wouldn't necessarily be killing hundreds of thousands of people, but will show he's kind of willing to go there to scare the world. I'm curious, to what extent there is, what the kind of escalatory ladder looks like from the Chinese perspective, whether there is this distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, if there's been kind of capabilities developed which aren't really, really big bombs, and how that kind of debate plays out internally in China on this topic.
Well, once the nuclear threshold is crossed, whether with large yield nuclear weapons or low yield tactical nuclear weapons, I think we will be entering a completely new era of human history. The nuclear taboo that has been maintained for decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be broken. I think from the Chinese perspective, any use of nuclear weapon is a major activity. I don't think China really thinks that tactical nuclear use would be less destructive. In the Chinese case, China itself has been certainly developing theater range nuclear forces. It is unknown whether China itself has low-yield tactical nuclear warheads. But in terms of the delivery systems, China has been procuring a larger number of theater range nuclear delivery systems. It's DF-21 medium range ballistic missile, DF-26 intermediate range missiles. They are all mostly useful against regional targets, including U.S. military bases in East Asia, or Guam, or U.S. aircraft carrier groups that would sail close to Chinese coast. But this is not necessarily an indicator of China willing to initiate nuclear conflict using theater range nuclear forces. I think because of the fact that China's conventional military capability is advancing very quickly, I think China has growing confidence that it could achieve conventional military superiority against the U.S. forces in the Asia-Pacific region in the future, which reduces the need for China to threaten or initiate nuclear use first in a conventional war. But because of this growing Chinese conventional superiority, I think China starts to worry in recent years that the U.S. may have greater incentive in the future to initiate a nuclear conflict. And therefore, China needs to deter that. And the Chinese investment into theater range nuclear forces could be a motivation to acquire the capability to respond in kind if the U.S. Initiate a limited nuclear war. Then China should have the capability to respond in a proportionate way to also retaliate in a limited manner using nuclear weapons. And that capability to respond in kind may be able to deter the U.S. from starting a limited nuclear conflict in the first place. So this thinking may be driving China's development of theater range nuclear forces. But again, this is a very dangerous path to embark on, because once both countries are aiming at achieving escalation management, it is very hard to contain arms race, because there is no clear boundary of what is sufficient crisis management capability. It is very easy for the two sides to eventually be dragged into a competition over escalation dominance, something that happened between the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. So I think this is a very important threat facing the two countries when it comes to their nuclear relationship.
So with this in mind, the idea that the West may be becoming increasingly more alarmed about these risks and potential miscalculation or accidents, while Chinese policymakers are not necessarily convinced by their ideas. I'm wondering what steps you believe might be taken to strengthen trust or at least some mutual understanding around these topics. I know you've previously written about potential confidence building measures, joint technological research. What do you think might be most helpful in this moment, or at least might be acceptable to both sides in trying to gain some clarity around the risks of nuclear escalation conflict?
I think we are reaching a point where China may be giving up on the hope to build confidence and trust with the United States through diplomatic engagement. I think the mainstream thinking here is the U.S. is determined to contain China and will use every means possible to do so. The U.S. is hypocritical in raising the nuclear risks. They employ double standards, so they are not sincere in achieving nuclear stability. The U.S. is really driven by the desire to acquire nuclear primacy over China, so that the U.S. would have even stronger political leverage against China. And with this understanding of Western intent and U.S. intent, I think this strengthens the power-centric thinking in Chinese policy community. people believe that it's meaningless to seek reaching common standing with the United States. The U.S. only understands power, so China should concentrate on building up its own capabilities. By the time that China can clearly demonstrate its superior capability, by the time China can clearly shift the balance of international power to China's favor, that's when the U.S. will eventually recognize the Chinese model, would respect China, and would listen to China as an equal partner. I think that's why we are seeing China investing so much resources into nuclear modernization. That doesn't mean that there is nothing left to be done. The stakes are simply too high. If we enter a downward spiraling nuclear arms race, it's not only costly economically, but also really dangerous because it does increase the risk of nuclear use. And a future military confrontation between China and the West is possible over Taiwan Strait or other regional flashpoints. And when that happens, the risk of nuclear escalation cannot be ruled out. So something has to be done. I think it's still possible to have some conversations and exchanges between China and the United States. China, I think, still is interested in receiving some type of strategic reassurance from the United States. U.S. has been a little reluctant to officially recognize a relationship of mutual nuclear vulnerability with China. U.S. has been reluctant to formally promise to accept strategic stability relationship with China. The Obama administration made some progress in doing so, but that promise was withdrawn by the Trump administration. At least that's the interpretation of U.S. policy. So if U.S. is, could be more forthcoming in discussing strategic stability with China, I think that may get some Chinese interest in starting some dialogues. The Chinese thinking on this issue is not necessarily clear. I don't think China itself has a good idea about how to maintain strategic stability. What type of U.S. measures is China expecting? Is China asking the United States to adopt a rhetorical policy of committing to bilateral strategic stability? Or is China asking the United States to cut down its nuclear forces to make its commitment credible? I don't think China itself has thought through these questions. So a bilateral dialogue on these issues could help promote internal Chinese deliberation on these issues and help China come up with a clearer position on these issues. Without further clarification of Chinese thinking, I think it's very hard to make progress. So I think U.S. shouldn't be afraid to offer to have a discussion on this issue because this is something that China wants to achieve. China wants, I think, U.S. to make a more explicit commitment on strategic stability, and the U.S. can use this as an opportunity to have China clarify its thinking, which may lead to more substantive discussion down the road.
Do you see any potential glimmers of hope on the horizon? Any measures that have been successful in the past or are currently working? Any room to expand mechanisms that seem to be working and creating this mutual understanding? Are there any channels of dialogue that are still open, and where do we go from here?
After the two presidents had a virtual summit in November last year, they discussed nuclear weapons issues. At least the Chinese president appeared to acknowledge the importance of having a dialogue on nuclear weapons and strategic stability. I think right now their officials are thinking about how to follow up this development and come up with more concrete options to look at. So we may be hearing more substantive proposals from the American side in the near-term future. I don't think China has a strong interest in discussing arms control issues, but if the U.S. starts with low-hanging fruits, easy measures like transparency or confidence building measures, risk reduction measures, those are still of interest to China. China wants to avoid unnecessary conflicts with the United States in the foreseeable future. China is interested in discussing the impact of new technologies on nuclear stability. So these topics could, be the starting point of a more serious and long-term dialogue. I think we, at this moment, given what is going on in Ukraine and there are more urgent issues in the bilateral relationship, nuclear weapons are not receiving a lot of attention. We may have to wait and see what happens, especially what specific proposals the United States comes up with.
So over the past few months, for whatever reason, I've had a lot of physicists on the show, and I know you haven't been, taking physics classes for a number of years now. But I'm curious, to what extent do you think the sort of mindset that being a physicist trains you in and applying it to these questions and these questions of international security, not necessarily from I understand how arms control like the technical sophistications, but more broadly in sort of applying the logic of physics reasoning to international relations. Is there anything that getting more trained physicists as opposed to lawyers making these sorts of decisions going forward? What's the upside to that potentially?
Well, I think the upside is physicists and scientists, they want to base their policy analysis on facts, right? They care more about facts. They want to get the facts straight. And this is what is seriously lacking in current policy study in China and maybe other places too. As I said, many of the policy experts, they know very little about the technical aspects of international security issues. And they just base their understanding on hearsay. And they just listen to what the state media says and they just believe it. And then they, provide their policy analysis and make policy recommendations based on it, without being aware that their understanding about the facts may be totally inaccurate. But as physicists, as scientists, I think people are more aware of the necessity to develop balanced understandings about facts. So I think the challenge today is the scientists, the physicists that are not speaking up. They may have their personal views about facts, but because of the overall political environment, they don't feel safe or they don't feel, they can't speak up. So there's no one there to correct the factual errors that is so widespread in the national narrative. I think that's deeply worrisome. So hopefully, given the stakes are rising, given the risk of a major strategic misunderstanding between China and the West, it's now time for the scientists, for the engineers, for the physicists to speak up, to conduct balanced and objective research, and to inform their policy experts, colleagues, and to inform the decision makers of what the facts are. And hopefully that will provide some opportunity to contain the serious information gap and perception gap between the two sides.
That was really beautiful. Thank you. let's all hope we can get a few more Andrei Sakharovs in the 21st century. Tong and Raven, thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
雨下整夜，装满了对你的爱，就像雨水源自落叶，照片在床上堆了厚一叠。那天晚上问你的话，不用急着答应，我只想送你回家里，你有足够充裕的时间了解我，是不是插进我的脑海里，全部都是你流过的身影，原本就很美丽，不用挖眼，巧遇来骗你。对你的爱一出就像雨水，源自落叶，照片在床上堆了厚一叠，雨下整夜，装满了对你的爱，就像雨水，源自落叶，照片在床上堆了厚一叠，我的敌人都知道你是我的把柄，像 Glock 真是我的把型 I don't care what the fuck is popping， 好多人小肉包口罩到停呀，我想把他们给甩掉，这样就来找你，只要我在你左右下来，你莫想爱到你，我感觉在不停的加剧，你总能识破我把戏，我来得在你之前，买2张机票带你去旅行到菲律宾，我最大的雨林看你冒我的德行，包里有雨衣，当天空在 dripping， 淋到你雨下整夜，装满了对你的爱，就像雨水源自落叶，照片在床上堆了厚一叠，雨下整夜，装满了对你的爱，就像雨水源自落叶，照片在床上堆了厚一叠，窗外的麻雀在叽叽喳喳叫个不停，猫和我想了解，都静静悄悄靠近，明明就很想我的你，会想念那天我低头看你睁大的眼，还有些语言没说完，是个下雨的夜，雨下着夜，我的爱一出就像雨水源自落叶，照片在我的床上堆了厚一叠，雨下整夜，我的爱一出就像雨水源自落叶，照片在我的床上堆了厚